The rain fell like shrapnel across the execution plaza, relentless and cold, drenching steel grates and the backs of armored guards who stood indifferent before the chained prisoners. Among the 20 condemned knelt Jonas Varen. His wrists bruised beneath restraints, mud soaking into the knees of his weather-beaten trousers. His head, recently shaven in preparation for the sentence, glistened with rain and resignation. 3 days earlier, he'd been skimming below Cythera's orbital patrols with a cargo bay full of unauthorized medical supplies bound for refugee encampments in the Hearth Wastes. Now he was just another name scrawled on the final page of a bureaucrat's ledger. Another body soon to be incinerated for the crime of compassion. The execution dais loomed ahead, a black monolith of polished alloy where justice and spectacle merged into one. Rows of foreign dignitaries watched from behind the rain-slicked veil of a canopy high above. Jonas had caught glimpses of them between bouts of thunder, their tall-robed figures, pale faces masked in diplomatic neutrality. Among them stood one unlike the rest, taller, regal, with glimmering sapphire skin patterned in white ceremonial sigils. Beside her stood two smaller figures, cloaked and child-sized, huddled against the storm. A drone's lens passed over the condemned with mechanical indifference as the herald began reading the charges in a voice amplified to pierce through thunder. Conspiracy against interplanetary commerce, subversion of sovereign control, breach of sector trade embargo. The familiar cadence of imperial condemnation rolled on like the storm overhead. Jonas neither bowed his head nor looked up. He simply breathed, tasted metal on the wind, and made peace with the inevitable. Then a sound pierced the monotony. Not thunder, not legal decree, but the high, clear voice of a child calling above the storm. It sliced through protocol like a blade, a single line that changed everything. She pointed not at the sky, not at the executioner, but at Jonas. "That's the man who saved me." Shock rippled outward. The herald faltered, his scroll trembling. All eyes turned. Jonas raised his head slowly, blinking against the downpour. The child's finger remained extended, unwavering, even as the storm lashed around her. Recognition dawned. She had been there 3 days ago when the marketplace collapsed under structural failure. Screams, smoke, debris. Jonas had pulled her from the rubble, cradled her body with bloody arms, and vanished before the militia arrived. No one had known, but someone had watched. The diplomat, the child's mother, stepped forward now. She was Seraya Thalen, regent of the Alaran sector delegation. Her gaze met Jonas's across distance and deluge. For a moment, nothing moved but the water. Then her voice rose like a bell tolling change. She invoked sanctuary under the interstellar trade accords. Diplomatic protection was hers to grant. The condemned prisoner was now a material witness to crimes against civilians. It was a legal blade sharp enough to draw blood from a stone. Murmurs turned to roars. A council magistrate protested, but Seraya countered with the precision of someone trained from birth to wield words as weapons. Treaty violations, political fallout, jurisdictional overreach. Her defense unfurled like a banner in the storm. Guards moved forward, uncertain, and then reluctantly obeyed. The others would die. Jonas would not. Shackles fell from his wrists. His knees trembled, unsure whether to stand. He followed her out of the plaza like a ghost returning from death, soaked in mud and memory. The others screamed as plasma charges armed. He did not look back. By nightfall, he was bathed, clothed, and seated in a diplomatic suite overlooking Cythera's industrial skyline, with a glass of amber warmth burning down his throat. Seraya stood across from him in informal robes, her ceremonial regalia replaced by a softer garment that hinted at something more personal beneath the armor of diplomacy. She addressed him directly, not as a criminal nor a guest, but as a responsibility. Her culture demanded it. His had never expected repayment. They were not the same, but something in the silence between them suggested a bridge could be built. Her children were safe, tended by instructors. He had no weapons, no allies, only the memory of a crumbled building and a girl's terrified scream. And yet here, in the aftershock of death, narrowly missed, they stood, one alien, one human, breathing the same air, watching each other, as if neither had ever truly seen another being before. The diplomatic corridors of Cythera felt more like prison walls than sanctuary to Jonas Varen. Though his shackles were gone, suspicion clung to him like a second skin. He was assigned quarters, protected by the trade accords, but every guard's gaze echoed the question, why him? Seraya Thalen had made a choice that would ripple across political spheres. She had taken a condemned man and tethered his fate to her own. What began as legal maneuvering had now become a collision of worlds moving too fast to stop. She remained composed, offering him meals, updates, and protocol, but beneath her formality burned a question she hadn't asked. Why had he done it? Saved a child, disappeared, asked for nothing. Jonas had no answers that fit into diplomatic briefings. He had spent most of his life in border sectors where laws changed with the price of oxygen, where children with broken limbs cried into silence because no one had the time or will to stop. Saving someone had never felt extraordinary. But to Seraya, raised among strategy and treaty, it was. Their routines began to overlap. Morning briefings, nightly debriefs, occasional shared meals where her daughters Nairi and Vexa peeked from behind privacy screens with wide eyes and too many questions. Seraya never left them alone with Jonas, but she began to leave the door open. It was during one such moment, a food delivery gone cold between them, that she faltered slightly, placing her hand against the wall to steady herself. He noticed. She waved it off, citing fatigue, but he caught the wince. He offered to help. She refused, then accepted without words. When they moved between wings of the compound the next morning, she walked slower, letting him pace beside her. They crossed a transit corridor, riddled with flickering light panels and an echo of distant protests. She paused subtly off balance. Without hesitation, Jonas reached out a hand at her elbow, steadying her. The touch lingered a second longer than necessary. The escape came suddenly, not from their sanctuary, but into chaos. A faction opposed to the Alaran delegation had breached the perimeter using stolen clearance codes. Sirens howled. Guards fell. Seraya activated defense protocols, but the security systems had already been corrupted. Jonas pulled her down a maintenance shaft as explosions trembled through the walls. Her gown tore. His hand bled from shrapnel. They ran through access tunnels filled with steam and broken machinery across maintenance walkways suspended above reactor cores. Somewhere along the route, Seraya's formal composure cracked. She no longer led. She followed. When they reached a decommissioned docking bay, the air was thick with heat and alarm klaxons. Jonas barricaded the doors with a hydraulic arm, while Seraya collapsed against a wall, panting. Her hair was soaked, her ceremonial markings smeared. She looked at him with something raw behind her eyes, an equation she could not balance. They had survived because of his instinct, not training, not orders, instinct. In the dark, with nothing but emergency lights casting shadows, she asked without words what kind of man risked death for the child of a stranger and carried an enemy to safety. He answered by pulling off his bloodied jacket and placing it around her shoulders. They didn't speak of it afterward. But when they rested hidden in a maintenance room beneath level C-17, Seraya didn't sleep on the opposite wall. She leaned against him, her body curled toward his like a moth drawn to heat. Her breathing slowed. His hand found hers, fingers brushing the tips of her low, the thin ribbon-like headtails that trembled with sensory information. She didn't recoil. Instead, she stilled completely, as if registering every vibration of his pulse through her own skin. She began asking questions in the quiet hours, not about tactics or negotiations, but about Earth, about oceans and forests, and why humans smiled when nervous. Jonas answered with stories, some real, some exaggerated for humor's sake. Nairi and Vexa laughed when they overheard his tale about chocolate being the most sacred Earth ritual. Seraya pretended to chide him, but her eyes gleamed with something soft. They ate together. He gave her the last of his ration bar. She tore off a piece and fed it back to him. The intimacy arrived, not in a kiss nor a confession, but in shared exhaustion. Her head against his chest after a narrow escape, his arm draped across her waist as tremors rattled the metal beneath them. She trusted him now, not just with safety, but with silence. She allowed herself to rest in his presence, knowing that if death came in the night, it would have to go through him first. And he in turn watched her sleep, not with hunger or conquest, but wonder. She was not fragile. She was forged, but even metal bent in warmth. They spent 3 days in the underbelly of the diplomatic compound, eluding patrols and sabotage drones. He taught her how to fire an old pulse weapon. She taught him to read Alaran glyphs. At one point, as they passed a collapsed section of corridor, Seraya stumbled and he caught her on instinct, lifting her over the rubble. She clung tighter than necessary. Her breath was near his neck. She smelled like copper and something floral like pressed starlight. When he set her down, she didn't let go right away. By the time they reached the forgotten hangar, both were filthy bruised and breathing in sync. They weren't captor and captive diplomat and smuggler. They were something else now. Not defined by politics, not forged by duty, but by the fire of every moment survived together. In the hollow stillness of the forgotten hangar, layered in dust and the scent of oxidized steel, they discovered the chamber. At first glance, it resembled a crash pod or ancient escape vessel, its surface veined with dormant bioluminescent patterns, Ellerin design unmistakable in its graceful organic curves. But Seraya recognized more. This was not merely a relic, it was a fragment of pre-unification Ellerin bioengineering technology once reserved for elite envoys who traveled beyond charted systems. It was, in essence, a living construct, half machine, half organism. Jonas approached it with curiosity, running his hand along the smooth shell. The pod pulsed faintly in response, as though aware of his presence. Seraya's breath caught. For such a dormant system to react to a human, especially one without Ellerin genetic markers, was either a miracle or a miscalculation of staggering proportions. She accessed a side panel, overriding its language protocols with difficulty. Symbols shifted, unlocking a central core interface that revealed a cocoon-like hollow within. Biostabilizing fluid shimmered inside, beckoning like a womb. The chamber's readout pulsed an alert: biosignatures incompatible, system degradation imminent. Injuries logged. External contamination detected. A choice had to be made. Jonas, ever pragmatic, examined his torn forearm, the skin swollen and infected beneath the soaked wrappings. His injuries had worsened, compounded by strain and exposure. Seraya hesitated, torn between duty and instinct. The chamber could cleanse and stabilize if configured properly, but it required resonance, bonded input, dual consent. Her pulse accelerated as she studied the alien interface. The only way to activate full healing protocols was to interface completely. Ellerin systems responded to shared presence, two minds in synchrony, enabling deeper access. She explained without explaining. Jonas didn't ask more than necessary. He simply nodded once. The pod opened like a flower unfolding at dusk. They stepped inside together, limbs brushing skin electric. Warmth enveloped them, liquid silk cushioning every movement. Panels sealed with a hiss. The light dimmed. Then came the breathless stillness of neural alignment. It wasn't pain, not exactly. It was disorientation wrapped in light. His consciousness, ragged and instinctive, brushed against hers, fluid, vast, calibrated like a star map. Thoughts were no longer isolated. Emotions bled across boundaries. He felt her fear, not of the pod or the bond, but of herself, of breaking rules that had defined her entire life. She felt his defiance, forged through years of watching systems fail the weak. Then came memory, her as a child among towering scholars, memorizing diplomacy before she could pronounce it. Him, 5 years old, watching his mother barter her wedding ring for antibiotics. Two timelines converged. Two hearts without a common language beat in perfect rhythm for the first time. Resonance clicked into place. The pod reacted instantly. Biolight surged, wrapping them in golden filaments. The infection in his arm receded. Her fractured energy field stabilized. But something else occurred. Something the interface had not predicted. Genetic synthesis. Not splicing. Not fusion. Recognition. Compatibility where none should exist. The pod's old programming surged with confused excitement, identifying optimal biological pairing. Hormonal cascades fired. Cells whispered to one another, ancient codes awakened by the proximity of what it defined as unity. Seraya felt the shift before she understood it. Her skin hummed with energy. Jonas pressed closer, his body reacting not from lust, but from instinct, raw, magnetic, elemental. Touch was no longer just sensation. It was language. Her low responded to his proximity lighting in ripples along their lengths. He reached up, fingertips gliding along one, and she shivered as if her spine were made of starlight. The interface deepened its connection, interpreting their shared consent as fusion protocol. Biological pathways merged temporarily, enabling accelerated regeneration and cross-species imprinting. It was beautiful and terrifying. Neither of them moved to stop it. In the safety of liquid warmth beneath the pulse of alien light, the tension that had grown over days melted into a deeper current. Their bond formed not through spoken promise, but through contact, unspoken understanding, and the trust only forged in moments of absolute vulnerability. Time folded inward, their bodies pressed in mutual need not for conquest, but completion. She was a map written in symmetries. He a compass drawn to pattern. When their skin met, it was like stars colliding. Breath merged, pressure built, and then stillness. Silence so complete it felt sacred. The pod dimmed cycles complete. Vital signs stabilized. But one signal remained faint, pulsing within Seraya's core. The chamber still linked to her biometrics logged a secondary sequence. Her neural pattern registered it before her conscious mind could. A warmth in her abdomen, a recalibration of internal systems. It was impossible, illogical, yet there it was. Jonas awoke, first cradled beside her in the emptied pod fluid receding. He helped her sit up. She looked at him, something uncertain flickering behind her eyes. He asked nothing. The air between them crackled with residual resonance. Their connection, though silent, had left imprints deeper than DNA. She touched her stomach lightly, as though not ready to say what her body already knew. Outside alarms continued. The threat hadn't passed. But inside that cocoon, the rules had changed. The line between species had been crossed not with violence, but with vulnerability. And in that ancient chamber beneath Cythera's bones, something new had awakened, quiet, as breath steady as heartbeat. They emerged from the chamber changed, though neither spoke of it. The air inside the hangar felt denser now, charged with something electric that pulsed just beneath their skin. Jonas moved differently, his steps surer, no longer burdened by pain. Seraya's gaze had shifted too. Calculated certainty tempered now by an undercurrent of instinct she had never allowed herself before. The bond forged in the chamber had left invisible threads that hummed quietly with shared memory and instinctive pull. They did not speak of what had passed, nor of the faint rhythmic pulse now echoing in her lower abdomen, but it traveled with them. The perimeter breach had triggered a full lockdown. Automated drones patrolled every corridor, their red optics slicing through the gloom. Jonas and Seraya, armed only with salvaged weapons, and the uncanny awareness of each other's presence, moved through maintenance shafts with ghost-like precision. Where once they moved with caution, they now moved as one. When Jonas scanned corners, Seraya was already calculating exit vectors. When Seraya reached for the next control panel, Jonas was passing her the right tool before she asked. It was more than coordination, it was symmetry. They encountered the first strike team near the central lift column. Jonas spotted them seconds before a full ambush, drawing Seraya back just as a volley of plasma scorched the wall where her head had been. Without needing a word, she rolled left, activated a pulse disruptor, and dropped their shields. Jonas returned fire, his aim precise, calibrated now with the ghost of her tactical awareness echoing in his reflexes. Targets fell, drones short-circuited. Heat scorched the edges of their clothing, and yet neither flinched. They fought as one mind split across two bodies. Later, when silence returned, they paused in a collapsed communications room, the floor littered with the skeletons of obsolete servers. Seraya touched a side panel, attempting to reconnect with any active network node. Jonas stood at the shattered window, watching smoke rise from the distant plaza. Their escape had triggered more than alarms. Political firestorms now raged in every diplomatic chamber on the planet. Their bond, unknown but not undetected, had altered resonance signatures across nearby systems. Sensors that scanned for biometrics were now flagging anomalies. Ellerin readings corrupted by human interference or enhanced by it depending on one's perspective. Their path through the underbelly of Cythera turned darker. Infiltrators had deployed adaptive units, combat drones configured to anticipate behavioral patterns. But those patterns failed. Jonas no longer moved like a rogue human, and Seraya no longer engaged like a classic Ilaran tactician. Their motions contradicted all predictive models. They disabled 3 squads in under 15 minutes, leaving behind only smoking debris and error logs full of contradictions. The machines could not parse the dual-threaded strategy now encoded in their movements. At one point, Seraya's hand grazed the back of Jonas's neck as they pressed through a narrow vent shaft. The contact was brief, but it sent a cascade of memory and sensation across their bond laughter from a forgotten Earth evening, the smell of powdered alloy, the echo of her children's voices. Jonas inhaled sharply, bracing himself against the wall. He wasn't ready for the weight of her full mind. She steadied him, placing her hand to his chest, focusing their link until the bleed stabilized. They resumed crawling, but the air between them throbbed with what had passed. They reached the embassy wing just before nightfall. Smoke veiled the hallways. Security systems were down. A small guard unit stationed to protect Seraya's daughters had been overrun by a wave of mercenaries hired to sabotage the diplomatic accords. The children had fled to a safe room. Seraya moved with precision now, accessing her inner reserves of authority. Jonas followed, weapon raised his shoulder, brushing hers at every turn. The safe room held, shielded by a low-frequency pulse barrier. The girls huddled inside, wide-eyed. Seraya held them close for a moment, then turned to Jonas. He nodded once, and together they restructured the room's defenses, using power diverted from a redundant reactor line. They knew the lull would not last. The next assault came hard. Thought Solan's private operatives, elite enforcers of the rogue trade faction, breached the outer security ring with plasma cutters and electromagnetic charges. Jonas and Seraya stood at the corridor's mouth side by side as automated warnings screamed overhead. She deployed a series of shock mines. He synchronized his fire with their detonation timing. Her mind threaded into his muscle memory. His intuition borrowed her calculations. They were no longer allies, they were synthesis. Where one ended, the other began. Jonas fired his last round into a power unit, sending shards through an enemy's armor. Seraya, her palm bleeding, activated an Ilaran shield generator from a broken console, funneling its output through his exosuit to create an improvised kinetic barrier. A blast rocked the chamber, forcing them back. When Jonas stumbled, Seraya caught him mid-fall. When her vision blurred from blood loss, he whispered something steady into the bond that returned her breath to rhythm. The final attackers fell beneath a collapsing ceiling beam Jonas had rigged with a sabotaged railgun coil. Silence. The air hung thick with smoke and heat. Jonas slumped beside the scorched wall, panting chest rising in shallow peaks. Seraya knelt beside him, touching his face, not with detachment but devotion. Her fingertips traced the line of his jaw. His hand found hers. The world outside still burned, but inside that moment they were whole. The children emerged once the smoke cleared, rushing to their mother. Jonas stood slowly, blood dried in the cracks of his palms. Neri clung to his side. Vexa tugged at his sleeve, her eyes bright with the innocence of those who still believed in heroes. He knelt to her level. She reached out and placed her hand flat against his chest over his heart and nodded once solemnly. It was not approval. It was recognition. Seraya watched from above her hand over her stomach, where a second heartbeat now pulsed. News of their survival spread faster than containment protocols. The council was already in session before dawn, a tempest of scandal igniting among representatives of every major species. Cythera's airspace was now under restricted traffic control, while secure diplomatic channels burned with encrypted accusations and panicked contingency plans. Seraya and Jonas were summoned without ceremony to the central chamber, escorted not by guards, but by silent figures whose silence suggested judgment had already been passed. Neri and Vexa were left in trusted care under biometric seal. Jonas had offered to stay behind, but Seraya had looked him in the eye and simply nodded toward the transport. They would face this together. The chamber was carved from luminous alloy walls, breathing faint pulses of light designed to echo with purpose and gravity. The High Council of Volantra sat in a crescent robes gleaming under biolux chandeliers. At the center sat Elandor Varric Archon, of the Ilaran core worlds, once Seraya's mentor, now her appointed judge. His lo were braided in silver, an honor reserved for those whose decisions shaped generations. Around him sat others, some familiar, others new, most carrying expressions carved from suspicion and protocol. Alandor's voice did not waver as he spoke her name. His tone was layered with disappointment and faint curiosity, as though trying to decipher what had driven the prodigy he'd once trained to abandon centuries of custom in a matter of days. Her response was measured, unwavering. She did not deny the reports. Yes, she had saved a human. Yes, she had invoked sanctuary. Yes, she had formed a neural resonance bond with Jonas Varen. No, she did not regret it. Jonas remained silent until one of the outer counselors, Celari, known for her purity doctrine, voiced what others had skirted around. Cross-species reproduction, biological contamination, the integrity of Ellerin genetics. These were not questions. They were accusations wrapped in rhetorical lace. Jonas stepped forward, voice low but firm, stating not his qualifications nor his innocence, but his commitment. He did not speak of politics. He spoke of Seraya's courage, of her daughter's laughter, of the night they nearly died together, and chose to live not out of protocol, but out of faith in one another. The room turned colder. Then Seraya spoke not with desperation, but with resolve. She detailed the night of their escape, the security breach, the technologies that had responded to Jonas's presence. She spoke of instinct, not design. The bond had not been created, it had emerged, naturally, organically. The healing chamber had merely catalyzed what the universe had already begun. She paused only once, placing her hand upon her lower abdomen. The pause was deliberate, subtle. Enough. The chamber went still. Alandor's eyes, sharp as solar glass, locked on hers. Confirmation was not needed. The neural harmonics from the pod had been recorded. The council had seen the signature. Hybrid genesis was no longer a theory, it was a reality. The silence shattered as debate erupted. Some spoke of precedent, others of disaster. A few saw opportunity, but the tide remained against them until a single voice cut through the storm. Lyanna Dareth, younger than most and twice as daring, rose with the authority of someone who had read every treaty ever signed and knew where the margins still breathed. She argued not for sympathy, but strategy. If the Ellerins sought longevity, adaptation was inevitable. This child, this anomaly, was not a threat, but a prototype. The convergence of two philosophies, two physiologies into something new. To erase that possibility would be to cut out the future before it had drawn its first breath. The council resisted, but Alandor did not call for a vote. Instead, he offered terms. Trials of understanding. Full cultural integration. If Jonas was to remain, if Seraya was to raise this child under Ellerin sovereignty, then the human would undergo the rites. Language, philosophy, biotechnical calibration, not as punishment, but as proof. Emerging not just of bodies, but of ideologies. Jonas accepted before the sentence was completed. The months that followed were as grueling as they were transformative. Jonas immersed himself in Ellerin history, learning not just their syntax, but the meaning braided into their metaphors. He walked meditation corridors where thought was weighted like gravity, where silence carried more weight than declaration. He failed. He adapted. He returned. Through every lesson, Seraya stood beside him, her own body shifting as life grew within her. The child began responding to stimuli far earlier than expected, reacting to tones, pulses, emotional shifts in Seraya's state. By the third month, biologists from 4 systems had requested observation rights. They were denied. This was not an experiment. This was a family. On the 15th week, Jonas passed the harmonic empathy trial, synchronizing his neural field to Ellerin resonance within the permissible deviation margin. Alandor, watching in silence, allowed himself a single nod. Protocol had been satisfied. And so on the night of convergence, beneath a sky draped in twin moons and bioluminescent blooms, the bonding ceremony commenced. No trumpets, no anthem, just a circle of light, a vow braided in 3 languages, and the touch of foreheads, an ancient sign. Seraya wore a robe of woven glass fiber, her low adorned with sapphiric tones. Jonas wore traditional Alarin vestments adapted for his frame. His fingers, calloused from years of hardship, closed around hers with reverence. When they kissed, it was not spectacle, it was the stillness of gravity finding center. Their daughters watched from the front row, hands clasped, smiles wide. The child within Seraya stirred. In that moment, the galaxy held its breath. 3 months later, the dawn over Volantra's southern hemisphere broke clear and impossibly bright, casting warm golden rays through the crystalline walls of the medical sanctuary nestled among the skyvault trees. Within its polished halls shaped from grown glass and stabilized organic alloy life prepared to enter the world. The room was silent save for the soft orchestration of biotechnical monitors and the faint hum of diagnostic light bands. Seraya lay reclined on a pressure-distributing support couch, her skin glowing with both perspiration and bioluminescence, the natural shimmer of an Ellerin in the final stages of gestation. Jonas stood beside her, one hand wrapped around hers, the other gripping the frame with the restraint of a man trying not to shatter from anticipation. His heart thundered in his chest, each beat a cacophony of fear, wonder, and disbelief. Around them, a small team of multi-species specialists operated with gentle precision, guided by Dr. Kale Rune, whose 6 arms moved with unbroken rhythm, adjusting harmonic levels and fluid balances as needed. Seraya's Lu rippled with contractions, her breathing guided by synchronized rhythm pulses emitted from the walls. The moment stretched impossibly long until it ruptured with a single, sharp cry. The child emerged with a howl that echoed into silence. Blue-tinged skin shimmered against the sterile air, fine markings just beginning to form along the temples and cheeks, neither fully Ellerin nor fully human and unmistakably whole. His body was human in structure, but his Lu unfurled like soft filaments of awareness, twitching with curiosity, even in his first breaths. Dr. K.L. Rune held him up with reverence, then passed him gently to Seraya, who pulled the child close with trembling arms. Jonas moved behind her, one hand cradling both of them, his cheek brushing against the downy crown of his son's head. They named him Caelion Theron, drawn from the convergence of their 2 traditions. The name carried history and invention in equal parts. Within hours, the birth was no longer just a family moment. It became legend, a symbol, a challenge, a new directive in the annals of both Ellerin and human cultures. News spread like wildfire through allied systems. Diplomats argued protocol while poets composed stanzas. Some called him an abomination, more called him a miracle. A handful whispered that Caelion might be the first of a generation that would bridge the ancient divides of civilization itself. Jonas spent every moment of the first days with his son pressed against his chest. He marveled at the faint glow of the child's skin in low light, at the way Caelion responded to harmonics played through the air, his tiny Lu reaching instinctively toward vibrations. Seraya sat nearby, recovering with the calm grace of one who had prepared all her life to lead, yet was now led by something far more primal. Love in its simplest and most terrifying form tethered her to the future in arms she had not expected to hold. Nyeri and Vexa became older sisters with gravity and glee. They fussed over Caelion's blankets, debated which lullaby harmonics he preferred, and took turns trying to decipher the subtle changes in his Lu patterns. Seraya watched them with silent awe, thinking of the tribunal chambers of Solari's cold rhetoric about dilution and of Alandor's cautious concessions. They had all tried to predict the outcome. None had foreseen this, the effortless way Caelion smiled at everyone who held him, the way his presence seemed to quiet even the most chaotic room. By the time Caelion reached his 3rd month, his babbling included tone-shifted syllables that mimicked Ellerin emotive structure, a feat that, according to developmental scientists, shouldn't have been possible until his 2nd year. His nervous system processed information faster than monitors could keep pace. He began responding not just to voices, but to emotion cooing in tandem with affection, retreating in mirrored distress. Jonas once caught him watching a diplomatic broadcast on a reflection panel, eyes wide, as though absorbing nuance from tonal patterns beyond even Seraya's comprehension. And yet, for all the marvels, their life remained tenderly ordinary in moments. Jonas walked the halls with Caelion nestled against his chest, humming broken earth tunes he barely remembered. Seraya would rest with her head in his lap, fingers tracing the faint scar on his wrist from the day they met. In quiet hours, when all the galaxy seemed far away, they simply sat in silence. Hearts bound by the tether of memory and consequence. Nothing had been easy. Everything had changed. Then came the delegation requests. One after another, councils, academies, governments, all asking for audience for access for observation rights. Seraya denied them all, at least for now. Kalion was not a specimen. He was a child. Their child. When Jonas suggested a public message, she agreed, not a declaration but a story. Together they crafted a joint communiqué delivered across diplomatic channels, recounting not just the science, but the emotion, the acts of mercy, the impossible choices, the bond forged in the ruins beneath Cythera's bones. The message closed with a single image: Kalion nestled between Nairi and Vexa. His low, curled in peaceful sleep, one hand grasping Jonas's finger, the other resting against Seraya's heart. As cycles turned and political positions softened, the true shift came not from policy, but from public response. Families across species lines began to share stories. Soldiers once ordered to fire upon civilians found themselves reconsidering their orders. Academics proposed interspecies empathy modules for early education. A medical coalition formed to study resonance-linked gestation. And among them all, the name Tharen became not just a symbol of new life, but of synthesis. In time, Seraya and Jonas stood again beneath the sky vault trees, watching their son take his first steps across roots that hummed with ancestral light. He paused, once turned toward them, and raised his arms. Not because he stumbled, but because he wanted to fly. Across the stars, stories like these often begin in war, in blood, in silence. But some take root in unexpected moments, when a child points at a prisoner and refuses to look away. This was not just a story of survival or politics or even romance. It was a tale of resonance, of what happens when instinct collides with diplomacy, when sacrifice gives way to connection, and when two lives refuse to accept the rules written before they were born. Jonas Varen and Seraya Thalen were never supposed to meet. Their bond was never in the data, never in the design. But it changed everything. Tharen, born of instinct and trust, now walks between worlds once divided by fear, and perhaps as more voices rise in harmony and more hands reach across lines once etched in steel, the impossible will become ordinary. If this story moved you, inspired you, or simply made you wonder what lies between the stars, we invite you to share it. Like, comment, and subscribe to stay with us as we explore more tales from the edge of the galaxy, where the smallest choices change the fate of worlds.